So for those of you that joined a little bit later, I'm Natalie and I'm a cognitive behavioural therapist. So it's CBT for short. I don't know if you're familiar with CBT, but for those of you that aren't, I'm predominantly interested in the way people are thinking about things and how people behave. And the idea is that if we can look at those two areas and make healthy changes to those areas, then we can help people improve how they feel. So today I'm just going to try and share my screen. See if I can do this. Okay, can you see my screen? Oh, 1 second.
Yes, we can, yeah.
You can, okay, great. Okay, I'm going to IT and the kind of recent pandemic. Now I can only see my screen, I can't see any of you. Is that, can you see me? I'm not very techie, so I don't really know if I've done this right.
I can see you, I think everyone else can, yeah.
Okay, fine, thanks. So I'm going to talk about what we call the anxiety equation. So what we mean by this is looking at how much anxiety a person experiences is often dependent on 4 different factors. I'm going to talk through those factors. There are other factors, but predominantly these ones are the ones that we're mainly interested in. So I'm just going to briefly describe what they are and then think about kind of what's going on in the world and just how that relates to this equation. So the first one is our perceived probability of threat. So that basically relates to the likelihood of something bad happening times our perceived cost or awfulness of danger, which relates to how bad it would be if the worst case scenario happened. So we've got a perceived likelihood and then how awful it would be. The one at the bottom here is our perceived ability to cope. So if the worst case happened, then how well do we think we're going to cope as an individual? Plus our perceived available rescue factors. So this basically relates to our confidence in the resources around us, whether it's the healthcare professionals, the support from family and friends. So those factors around us and how they can help us cope. So generally speaking, if we've got a hypothetical worry, there tends to actually be a big discrepancy between how likely something is and how awful something is. And we cannot completely eliminate the risk of bad things happening. So unfortunately, every time we leave the house, there's always a risk that something awful can happen. But often we're quite confident that the likelihood is so low that we don't feel anxious about it. So if we think of something, let's think about flying, for instance, we could probably all agree that an accident in an aircraft would be absolutely devastating and awful, but we're quite confident, or very confident, that the likelihood is very low, therefore we feel we're able to cope with that risk. Now, people that have a fear of flying might become very preoccupied with that, overthinking the worst case scenario and maybe avoiding planes. And those behaviors actually increase our perceived likelihood that the bad thing will happen, which I'm going to come on to in a second, talking about what feeds that likelihood. So now we want to think about, okay, well, how does this relate to kind of what's going on in the world at the moment? So if we go to this slide, now we can see a timeline of what's happened in the UK in terms of the COVID outbreak. Now, in early January, we were living our lives and nothing had changed. We might have heard a little bit of news press about what was going on in China, but it was so far away that actually the likelihood of us getting it was really low, and perhaps we weren't feeling anxious at all because nothing was different in our world. And then around the 29th of January, the first 2 cases of COVID are recorded. So naturally, it's getting closer, and perhaps we might be feeling a little bit more anxious. And then, as we can see, as time goes on, more measures are taking place. and the perception of likelihood is increasing as time goes on. Now, if we go back to our previous slide, the perceived probability of threat. Now, I went to Italy on the 14th of February, and there were only 2 recorded cases. So my perception of that threat was quite low, because there were only 2 recorded cases. Despite the fact that I was hearing about how awful it was in the world, I thought I was safe. What did I do to cope, which is the green one here, is I took some hand sanitizer with me and I was washing my hands quite regularly. But if we think about what happened in the interim between February and March, the perceived probability was increasing because the media was giving us kind of lots of coverage about stories about what was happening in Italy. So we could see that actually it was getting closer to the UK, and the perceived awfulness, we could see that the cases were rising, the deaths were rising. And at that stage, before the 23rd of March, the government hadn't put in stringent measures in place. So we might assume that perhaps our perceived confidence in our rescue factors, in our confidence of others might be quite low, because no one's experienced a pandemic before. Nobody knows how to cope or what's going to happen. It's quite uncertain. Those stringent measures aren't in place. But if we think about, not that we're getting into politics here, but Brexit's taken months and years to organise, and now the government have a matter of weeks and months to figure out how the country is going to operate when we come to a complete standstill in the economy. So what did we see? We saw that actually people were just trying to cope in any way that they knew how. And that, in terms of what did that look like? Well, everyone was going to the shops and panic buying because the likelihood was going up, the awfulness was going up. We weren't sure about guidance too much at this stage. So people were coping in any way that they knew how, which was to go and buy hand sanitizers and food in preparation for the worst case scenario. And a lot of people thought that was greedy and selfish, which some, you could view it that way. But if we look at this equation, it seems quite understandable that people would just try and behave in a way that they felt was going to keep themselves safe. So I'm just going to exit this a second and come back. Sorry, like I said, I'm not very techie. I'm just going to see if I've got any questions. No, okay. So I will go back, view. Okay. So we want to be thinking about this equation. Half of it is in and half of it is in green. And that, I suppose, reflects kind of what we can do about this now. So if we think about what I've got here in white at the top, think about what's increasing our perceived likelihood that something bad. Now, if I were to invite you all to go out today, or maybe not go out, but go online and buy a lottery ticket today, and let's just say that the draw is in a week's time, and your task every day was to think about exactly how you were going to spend your winnings, in 7 days' time, we could probably predict that your perception of how likely it would be that you would win is going to increase. You almost would have convinced yourself that perhaps you were going to win, you were going to buy that yacht or that villa in Spain. I think my dad does that quite a lot. But it's basically reflecting that the more we think about something and we become preoccupied, the more we can that the worst case scenario is likely. And with, I suppose, what's going on in the world, there is a real threat because we can see precautions have been guided and given to us. But if we're at home, then actually there's more opportunity to engage in overthinking, and that's actually just going to make us feel worse. So we want to try and contain that as a behavior. And I say it's a behavior because if we're sat on the sofa for an hour is thinking about this virus and what would happen and how awful it would be, then that becomes a behavior. And again, with the media, the Daily Mail especially, always kind of printing the worst case scenario stories, that makes it feel like it's really close to home. And of course it is close to home, but again, if we're spending a lot of our time, tuning into the news, we're going to get quite anxious about this. So those two behaviors might be ones that we want to be very cautious about. Previous experience can, of course, influence our perceived likelihood of something bad happening. An example of that is before Easter, I knew that I had a couple of hospital appointments coming up. I was quite anxious about it because obviously, you'd think being in hospital is safe, but at the moment, there's this idea that actually being in hospital is probably quite a risky place to be. And unfortunately, I did fall ill and I was in hospital over the Easter period, which was the peak of the virus. And I was unwell and I came home and I recovered and I didn't catch the virus. So for me personally, my perceived likelihood of getting it when I go in for my hospital appointments is now lower because I've had that previous experience. But again, people have had negative previous experiences that are going to influence their perceived likelihood of something bad happening. So ideally, we don't want to be focusing on the two above because yes, there is some risk, there is a likelihood, and depending on kind of who you are, the awfulness might vary. And I know again there's lots of opinions about this and media coverage, and at the beginning of the pandemic and the lockdown, we saw that perhaps some of the younger generation who felt very fit, healthy and well might not have taken the precautions so seriously, because if we go to this one at the bottom left, they perhaps felt that they were able to cope and they were more resilient to the virus. And those behaviors obviously perhaps make other people who are more vulnerable feel more anxious. So if we want to be focusing, okay, well, what can we do during this kind of this pandemic rather? Now, bottom right, perceived available rescue factors. Now, this again refers to our confidence in the resources around us. Now, we as general people of the public have no control over when there's going to be a cure, when the treatment's going to be ready, medications that are available, or the vaccines. So any of our time and energy given to that particular area isn't going to help progress and development. So actually, we might not want to be focusing on that because it's going to be energy that is going to be wasted for us and potentially makes us feel more anxious. So 50% we want to be focusing on this area is what can we do? Now, if we're living alone, we might feel very vulnerable, but there is so many kind of there's so much kind of amazing support out there locally, depending on what area you're in. So we could reach out to kind of local volunteer support. We're about to launch an emotional hotline, a befriending service, signposting service. I think that's due to go out tomorrow. More information coming on that. The street champions, so if you're not able to leave your house, there are other people that can go out and do your shopping for you. And also there's the friends and family and connections online that we want to keep in tune with. So that is obviously within our control. So how do we strengthen our perceived ability to cope? Now, this refers to, what we can do that is within our control. So what we don't want to be thinking too much about the likelihood of getting the virus, excuse me, because the government's doing that for us. We can limit our media coverage and just follow their guidance. We can adopt a healthy lifestyle, and just as importantly, is to establish a daily routine. If we're stuck and confined to our house, then we want to be in a healthy routine that gives us some structure, some purpose, and helps our mental, physical well-being. Exercise and hobbies, relaxation, meditation. So that's just a kind of brief overview of the anxiety equation and how it relates to the pandemic. If we go back to kind of general worries, let's say I work with a client and they have a fear of flying and they're avoiding getting on the plane. I would be asking them, okay, out of 10, how likely is it that something bad is going to happen? Now, the likelihood is going to be very low. That question is really important when people are feeling anxious about the what ifs. So how likely is it that something bad is going to happen? If the figure is really low, then there is no point us giving our time and energy because it's going to make us feel worse. Of course, that's easily said than done. And within CBT, we have particular interventions to help contain the amount of time that we worry. But there are actual worries that are warranted with real threat and likelihood. So, for example, I've worked with clients who have come in and they have a family member who may be terminally ill and has been ill for a really long time, and their worry is, well, what if they die? And yes, that's going to be absolutely devastating and awful, of course. And also the likelihood is high because they're terminally ill. So in that case, what we would be focusing on is they're increasing their perceived ability to cope and their perceived available rescue factors. And obviously, if we come back to the pandemic, as each week passes, the guidance is changing. So it's almost very difficult to prepare in terms of what the new life is going to look like once the lockdown eases. So if I move to this slide, where are we now? Implementation of the precautions that are taken. So high risk here on the right side, there's a high likelihood of the virus, and we do not take any precautions, then yes, there is going to be a high risk. Now, if we're adhering to the lockdown, then our perception of getting the virus is going to be lower. So what we're finding now is that actually people's anxieties have reduced because everyone is at home. We're in our safety zones, and we're pretty, we're contained. We're away from everyone else, so we feel confident that we're not going to catch it. Now, I've had a few clients this week say to me, well, how do I prepare for what happens when we go back to the real world, when I've got to go back to work? And I suppose the answer that I'm giving is actually it's very difficult to prepare because we've not yet been given that exit plan or that guidance. And it might be quite naturally that when the lockdown eases, a lot of people are going to feel anxious. And I think that's quite normal because our precautions are changing and we are, going to be out interacting with people. And it's only, I suppose, I think it's next week when the government announces what precautions are in place, we can then begin to think about how that's going to affect each individual and how it relates to them in their lives. Now, if I've just come back to this screen, I appreciate that I'm talking quite quickly and I'm giving you kind of so much information, but do come back with questions if you are feeling a bit overwhelmed. Our perceived ability to cope is going to vary depending on who we are. And what I've kind of written down here is for, I suppose, the general public. But if we've got kind of a nurse or doctor working on the front line, then obviously their formulation is going to look very different and their coping strategies are going to be very different. And their emphasis might be on PPE, whereas that's perhaps not going to be applicable for somebody who is staying at home 7 days a week. So that's, I suppose, where I've got to in terms of psychoeducation and debriefing where we're up to now. I suppose there might perhaps be a whole new stance on things once lockdown eases and kind of how we manage that as a community.